What goes through her mind the moment she realizes you'll never text again? Not later, not someday. Not when emotions settle or time smooths things over. Never. The silence she once leaned on for comfort stops feeling soft. It hardens. It turns into a mirror showing her something she avoided for too long. A man who no longer needs to speak to be understood. A man whose absence now carries more weight than his presence ever did. At first, it unsettles her. She misreads your peace as indifference, your stillness as disappearance. But here's the truth she doesn't see yet. Brother, silence held with purpose is not emptiness. It's clarity. It's what happens when a man stops reacting to noise and starts governing himself. You didn't go quiet to win a game. You didn't pull back to create fear. You stopped because you finally understood something most men never do. You cannot chase peace through chaos without destroying it. That's the moment silence stops being a reaction and becomes a position. And it exposes the real question beneath everything. Who is actually in control? The one who keeps reacting, or the one who no longer needs to? That's what this video uncovers. Not drama, not fantasies, but the exact psychological shift that begins inside her. The night your silence becomes permanent, and how that same stillness quietly transforms you, from the man who waited into the man she can no longer place, predict, or control. Before we go further, make this clear for yourself. Drop a 1 in the comments if your instinct is still to react, explain, or reach out. Drop a 2 if you're choosing silence, holding your center, and refusing to abandon yourself again. If this speaks to where you are right now, like the video, subscribe to Stoic Station, and start this journey now, because what comes next is the moment her sense of control quietly dies, and a reversal begins she never saw coming. 1. The night control quietly dies. She didn't panic when she left. She didn't fall apart during the conversation, the distance, or the silence she thought she wanted. The panic came later, on a night she never prepared for, the night she realized you weren't coming back. Most people believe emotional collapse happens in moments of drama, raised voices, tears, final arguments. But real psychological damage doesn't arrive with noise. It arrives after the noise is gone, when certainty quietly disappears, when there's no fight left to win, no reaction left to provoke. It happens on an ordinary night. She checks her phone without urgency, not out of longing, but out of habit, a reflex built from months, maybe years, of knowing you were there. She expects something small, your name, your concern, a sign of presence she no longer consciously valued but subconsciously depended on. And there's nothing, no message, no missed call, no emotional safety net waiting beneath the surface. At first it doesn't register as loss, it doesn't feel dramatic, it feels confusing, because the silence she meets doesn't behave like the silence she once used. It doesn't feel like space. It feels like a door quietly locking behind her, without sound, without force, without ceremony. And then the realization begins to settle. You didn't pull back to teach her a lesson. You didn't go silent to provoke a reaction. You didn't disappear to regain leverage. You accepted the ending. And that acceptance, calm, final, unannounced, is the one thing control cannot survive. Because control relies on expectation, on predictability, on the quiet belief that access is permanent, even when taken for granted. The moment that belief dissolves, the illusion collapses with it, not loudly, not violently, but completely. Stoic silence doesn't announce itself. It doesn't explain. It doesn't ask to be understood. It simply removes access. And when access disappears without drama, without bitterness, without emotional residue, something unsettling happens inside her. The story she thought she was still directing suddenly continues without her input. That's when fear replaces comfort. Not the fear of being abandoned, but the fear of being irrelevant. Because what she feels in that moment isn't heartbreak, it's displacement. The realization that the man she assumed would always remain emotionally reachable has quietly stepped outside her orbit, that the role she thought she occupied in your inner world is no longer guaranteed. And once that control dies, once the certainty that you will return fades, something far more uncomfortable moves in to replace it. Reflection. And that reflection will not be gentle. 2. Silence turns into a mirror. A woman can ignore messages, but she can't ignore what silence eventually shows her about herself. At first, distraction works. It always does. When the noise of a connection disappears, the instinct is to replace it with more noise. She fills her days with social plans, new conversations, digital movement. Messages come from other names. Notifications still light up her screen. From the outside, it looks like progress. From the inside, it feels like relief. She tells herself she's fine, that this was the right decision, that what she left behind was just another chapter, closed, finished, forgettable. And for a while, that story holds. But silence doesn't chase her version of events. It doesn't interrupt her distractions. It doesn't argue, explain, or try to reinsert itself into her life. Your absence doesn't react to her certainty. It doesn't flinch when she moves on quickly. It doesn't bend to indifference. It waits. And waiting is what makes it dangerous. Because one evening, without warning, the mirror appears, not through memory alone, but through contrast. She notices the difference between the conversation she's having now and the calm she once took for granted. She starts replaying moments she dismissed too easily, efforts she minimized, emotional steadiness she assumed would always be available, simply because it had been. That's when the realization forms, not all at once, but sharply enough to cut through distraction. She didn't just lose attention, she discarded grounding. And the mirror that silence becomes is not kind, because silence doesn't soften reality. It clarifies it. There are no emotional filters, no comforting narratives, just a clean reflection of what was there, and what she walked away from without fully understanding its value. When a man holds silence with discipline, it doesn't fade into the background. It turns inward. It becomes psychological. It forces reflection without accusation. It shows her things she never wanted to see. Moments of arrogance masked as confidence. Impulsive choices justified as freedom. Emotional immaturity hidden behind certainty. And in that reflection, a question rises. Quiet, persistent, impossible to dismiss. What did you walk away from? Not who did you leave, not what went wrong, but what did you remove from your life that was holding you steady? That's the difference words could never create. Arguments invite defense. Silence invites truth. Because without your presence to react to lean on, to blame, the responsibility has nowhere else to go. The mirror points inward. She didn't lose you. She lost the emotional foundation she was standing on, and only realized it once the ground felt unstable beneath her feet. And if you're listening to this, there's a lesson here for you too. Ask yourself honestly, have you ever mistaken someone's steadiness for something disposable until it was gone? Have you ever underestimated the value of calm simply because it didn't demand attention? Because once the mirror finishes its work, the story doesn't end there. Something subtle begins to shift. Something invisible starts to move beneath the surface. And when that movement turns into pull, the silence changes again. 3. The gravity of absence. The strongest pull in the universe isn't loud, it's invisible. Stability is almost always misunderstood while it's present. When it's there, it blends into the background. It feels ordinary, predictable, safe in a way that doesn't stimulate urgency. But the moment it's gone, it reveals its true weight. And that's when the craving begins. She once labeled your calm as predictable, your consistency as boring, your emotional discipline as too safe. To her, excitement lived somewhere else, where emotions spiked quickly, where intensity replaced steadiness, where chaos felt like passion. Your presence didn't thrill her nervous system. It regulated it, and because regulation feels quiet, she underestimated it. So when you disappeared, she didn't feel panic at first. She felt free, free to explore new energy, new faces, new conversations. She looked for replacement stimulation, men who were louder, quicker to react, faster to engage. Men who filled silence with words, filled space with performance, filled moments with urgency. On the surface, it looked like momentum. It looked like movement forward. But something subtle began to surface. None of them replicated the atmosphere you brought into a room. Other men talked too much, as if silence made them uncomfortable. They reacted too fast, as if emotion controlled them rather than the other way around. They needed too much attention, reassurance, validation. They didn't hold space. They demanded it. And slowly, painfully, she noticed the difference. What she once called boring now felt rare. What she once dismissed as predictable now felt grounding. The calm she thought she outgrew was the very thing missing from every interaction that followed. Conversations felt noisy but shallow. Energy felt intense but unstable. There was movement, but no center. That's when your absence changed shape. It stopped being emptiness and became gravity. Not because you vanished, but because you stayed centered. Calm men don't chase attention. They attract it. Balanced men don't compete for presence. They create contrast without effort. And when that contrast disappears, it leaves behind a vacuum that can't be filled by volume or excitement. She doesn't feel this pull all at once. It creeps in quietly, late at night. In moments where distractions fade and comparison becomes unavoidable, she starts realizing that what she lost wasn't conversation. It was regulation, not excitement, but peace. And this is the part most people misunderstand. She doesn't miss your messages. She misses the version of herself that felt grounded around you, the version that didn't need to perform, the version that felt steady without effort, the version that could breathe without constantly reacting. That's the real gravity of absence. It doesn't pull her toward you, it pulls her toward what she lost inside herself when you left. So notice this carefully, especially if you're listening from a place of doubt or pain. Peace is only boring to those who haven't lost it. Calm is only invisible to those who have never lived without it. Because once gravity replaces distraction, something else can no longer hold together the way it used to. And that's when the ego begins to crack. 4. When the ego collapses. Ego doesn't shatter from heartbreak. It collapses from comparison. Pride has a quiet way of convincing people they can always do better. It whispers that options are endless, that what feels steady is easily replaceable, that patience is weakness and loyalty is dependence. As long as belief stays untested, it feels like truth. But reality has a way of challenging pride without argument. By contrast, she once believed you were replaceable. She told herself that your calm meant a lack of depth, that your consistency meant a lack of passion. She interpreted your patience as tolerance for less, your loyalty as emotional reliance. In her mind, walking away wasn't a risk. It was an upgrade, because ego doesn't measure value by substance. It measures value by availability. And then the world stepped in. Not all at once, not dramatically, but steadily, through experience. Each new man she met highlighted something you never needed to prove. Conversations that felt impressive at first revealed emptiness over time. Confidence turned out to be performance. Energy turned out to be instability. What seemed exciting in the beginning felt exhausting once the novelty wore off. And slowly, the reframing began. You weren't boring. You were disciplined. You weren't distant. You were intentional. You weren't weak. You were self-governed. Each realization didn't arrive with regret. It arrived with discomfort, because every comparison chipped away at certainty. Every interaction forced her to confront the same question from a different angle. Why did what she thought she wanted feel so different from what she actually lost? This is how ego collapses, not through pain, but through awareness. Stoic strength is rarely recognized in the moment. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't compete for attention. It doesn't need to be validated to exist. It simply sets a standard, quietly, consistently, that other men can't meet without doing the internal work they avoid. And when that standard disappears, everything else is measured against it, whether she wants it to be or not. That's the irony of discipline. It looks ordinary until it's gone, then it becomes irreplaceable. At some point, she stops asking whether she can find someone better and starts noticing how often she's comparing others to you. Not consciously at first. It shows up in disappointment, in restlessness, in the feeling that something essential is missing but hard to name. And that's when the shift becomes undeniable. You stop being a choice. You become the benchmark. Not because you demanded it, not because you stayed long enough to convince her, but because your absence revealed the difference between men who perform confidence and men who live it. And there's a lesson here that goes beyond her experience. Ask yourself honestly, what traits do people only value once they can't find them elsewhere? How often is discipline overlooked in favor of excitement? How often is emotional control mistaken for emotional distance, until chaos becomes exhausting? Because ego doesn't collapse when someone leaves. It collapses when comparison exposes truth. And once that collapse happens, the dynamic can no longer stay the same. Certainty weakens. Assumptions fall apart. The balance of power begins to move. Not loudly, not aggressively, but inevitably. And when the ego gives way, control quietly reverses. 5. Control shifts without warning. The moment she stops knowing her place in your life, everything changes. Control never looks like control while it's happening. It feels like comfort, familiarity, certainty. It lives in patterns. Who texts first? Who explains? Who softens? Who comes back? As long as those patterns remain predictable, power feels invisible. But the moment predictability disappears, control doesn't weaken slowly. It vanishes. Because control depends on a map, and silence removes the map. At first, she doesn't feel threatened. She feels curious. She starts checking small things, almost unconsciously. Your stories, your online status, the gaps between your activity. She's not trying to reconnect yet. She's trying to locate herself, to confirm that she still exists somewhere in your emotional world, that her position hasn't changed, even if the distance has. This is where the shift begins, because your silence doesn't respond. It doesn't clarify. It doesn't reassure. It doesn't react to her curiosity, her checking, her subtle signals. There's no anger to read, no pursuit to anticipate, no emotional temperature to measure. The feedback loop she once relied on simply stops. And that uncertainty is worse than rejection. Anger is readable. Chasing is predictable. Even distance, when it's emotional, can be managed. But calm absence offers nothing to grab onto. Her mind doesn't spiral because you left. It spirals because she no longer knows where she stands. The reference point she used to orient herself, your availability, your reactions, your emotional accessibility, is gone. And without that reference, she feels unmoored, not abandoned, disoriented. This is the part most people misunderstand about silence. Silence doesn't become powerful because it confuses someone else. It becomes powerful because it's no longer trying to be understood. When silence is rooted in self-respect, it carries authority. Not the loud authority of dominance, but the quiet authority of boundaries that don't need to be announced. You're not withholding to manipulate. You're withdrawing to protect peace. And that distinction changes everything, because a man who goes silent out of resentment still revolves around her reaction. A man who goes silent out of clarity does not. That's why the dynamic flips without warning. She expects the past version of you, the one who would eventually explain, re-engage, soften. Instead, she encounters someone who no longer organizes his emotional world around her presence or absence. Someone who doesn't chase certainty because he's built it internally. And that's the realization that unsettles her most. She doesn't miss you. She misses the control she no longer has. The ability to predict you, to influence your emotional state, to know that no matter what, you would reappear in a familiar way. Now, that certainty is gone. So write this down and don't rush past it. Certainty is power. Silence removes it, not as punishment, not as strategy, but as a natural consequence of a man reclaiming his emotional center. And when certainty disappears, curiosity takes its place. Questions form where assumptions used to live. The past becomes something to test, not rely on. And eventually, almost inevitably, she reaches out. Not because she's ready to return, not because she's suddenly clear, but because she's expecting the past. And what she meets next will determine everything that follows. 6. When she texts and meets someone new. She sends the message, but the man she's texting no longer exists. Reaching out isn't always about love. More often it's about reassurance, about checking whether the door is still unlocked, whether the emotional gravity she once felt still pulls on you the same way. She doesn't type with urgency or vulnerability. The message is casual, harmless, a soft tap on the glass rather than a knock. It's designed to test the temperature, not to rebuild the connection. And that's exactly why the moment matters. Because what she encounters on the other side doesn't feel familiar. Your tone is different, not distant, measured, not guarded, steady. There's no urgency in your words, no emotional pull beneath the surface, no subtle reach for validation. You respond without leaning forward. You speak without trying to reopen anything. And the absence of that old energy is what catches her off guard. That freedom unsettles her more than silence ever did. Silence can be misread as anger, pride, or withdrawal. Freedom cannot. Freedom has weight. It signals completion. And that's what she feels immediately. Not rejection, not coldness, but wholeness. You're present without being available. Calm without being compliant. Engaged without being invested in outcome. This is the difference Stoic transformation creates. It isn't about winning the exchange or proving growth. It's about no longer needing the exchange to feel grounded. You're not responding to change her mind. You're responding because it aligns with who you are now, or you're not responding at all for the same reason. Either way, your sense of self isn't hanging in the balance, and that's what disorients her. She expected influence. She expected to feel the familiar shift, the emotional feedback that once told her she still mattered in the same way. Instead, she meets a man whose center doesn't move, a man who doesn't need reassurance from her curiosity, a man who isn't waiting for the past to resume. This isn't indifference, it's detachment with dignity. Indifference shuts down to avoid feeling. Detachment stands open without being pulled. One is avoidance, the other is mastery. And she can feel the difference immediately. Your words don't carry resentment. Your silence doesn't carry threat. Your presence doesn't carry need. It carries peace. That's why the moment lands heavier than she expects. She didn't come back to reconnect. She came back for influence. And she met a man who no longer offers it freely. So notice this, especially if you're navigating that first message after silence. The goal was never to appear strong. The goal was to be strong enough that the outcome doesn't define you. When you reach that place, silence stops being a tactic. It becomes a state, and from that state, the story moves forward in a way that neither of you can control anymore. 7. Silent ascension. There's a moment when silence becomes who you are, not something you use. Most people spend their lives chasing closure. They want explanations, apologies, final conversations that tie everything up neatly. They believe peace comes from answers. Stoic men learn a harder truth. Peace comes from clarity. And clarity doesn't require agreement. It requires alignment. This is the stage where something fundamental changes inside you. You stop reacting, not because you're numb, but because reaction no longer serves you. You stop explaining, not because you're hiding, but because you no longer need to be understood to move forward. You stop negotiating your peace, not because you've given up, but because you've decided it's no longer for sale. This isn't withdrawal, it's ascension. She senses it almost immediately, but not in the way she expects. There are no speeches, no declarations, no dramatic shifts she can point to. She feels it through absence of need, through the lack of emotional tension she once relied on, through the calm space where urgency used to live. That absence is louder than any message you could send, because the quiet she once celebrated when she believed you still wanted her now reflects something else entirely. It no longer mirrors your longing, it mirrors her loss, and that realization doesn't arrive as regret or guilt. It arrives as disorientation. The ground feels different. The rules no longer apply. The version of you she thought she understood has stepped out of reach. This is where most men get confused. They think power means reclaiming the connection, getting the text, reopening the door, proving they've changed. But real power doesn't come from winning something back. It comes from realizing you don't require it to define your worth. That your value was never dependent on being chosen again. When silence reaches this stage, it stops being a tactic entirely. It becomes a state of being, a way you move through the world, calm, self-governed, intact. You're no longer orienting yourself around her reactions, her curiosity, or her distance. You're oriented inward, toward what you tolerate, what you protect, and what you refuse to abandon again. Brother, this is the shift, not hers, yours. Because the moment you stop needing the outcome loses its power over you. The moment you stop waiting for the story to resolve, you step out of it altogether. And from that place, whether she reaches out or disappears completely becomes secondary. Your center remains. So before anything else unfolds, sit with this question. Don't rush past it. Don't answer it quickly. Who are you when no one is pulling on your emotions anymore? That answer is the beginning of your next chapter. Before we end this chapter, pause for a moment, not to think about her, but to think about yourself. Because the real lesson in everything you've just heard was never about what silence does to her. It was about what silence returns to you. You didn't go quiet to make her regret anything. You went quiet because at some point, continuing to speak began to cost you your peace. And that's the truth most people never say out loud. Silence isn't chosen when a man wants power over someone else. Silence is chosen when a man finally wants power over himself. When you stop texting, stop explaining, stop chasing closure, you're not withdrawing love. You're withdrawing emotional dependency. And in that space, something rare happens. You start to feel your own center again. Your reactions slow down. Your thoughts become clearer. Your self-respect stops negotiating. That's why her reaction, whatever it is, becomes secondary. Because the moment silence gives you back your footing, you realize something quietly revolutionary. You don't need to be understood to move forward. You don't need validation to stay grounded. You don't need her response to confirm your worth. What you lost wasn't a relationship. What you lost was the habit of abandoning yourself to keep someone else comfortable. And what silence gives back, if you let it work, is not control, revenge, or triumph. It gives you alignment. Alignment between who you are and what you're willing to tolerate. So if you're watching this and wondering, did I do the right thing by staying silent? Ask a better question. Do I feel more at peace now than I did when I was trying to hold on? Because if the answer is yes, then regardless of what she does next, you've already crossed the most important threshold. You didn't win her back. You didn't lose her either. You found yourself again. And once that happens, the rest of the story unfolds very differently. If this message resonated with you, don't rush to react to it. Sit with it. Let it settle. If you found value here, like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to Stoic Station. And when you're ready, join me in the next chapter, where we explore what happens after silence has done its work. Stay grounded, stay disciplined, and stay with me.